Okay, Taylor, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good. Okay, I want to hear about your routine this morning. I'm curious. I'm always curious when somebody is a high-performing individual that coaches high-performing individuals, what they're actually doing themselves.
The full shebang?
Yeah, the full shebang. Give us everything.
Yes, I got up around, it was about 6 o'clock. Did a little bit of a mindfulness practice, which for me at this stage and phase really is pretty straightforward. It's just taking a couple of minutes just to sit down and journal. It's okay, what's my intention for the day? And then I do a little bit of breath work. So do a guided meditation for that. And then I got right into working. In the past, I think I've spent more time of having a much more elaborate morning routine. But as of lately, I've just been so motivated and energized, like just get after it. I usually get up, do a few things, and I get into it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what did you eat?
Oh, okay. So worked for a couple hours and then had a couple calls. And then before I came here, I had some eggs and tortilla from Central Market because I love their tortillas. Homemade, it's fresh every day.
You and my dad.
Good. With some refried black beans and a little bit of hot sauce. And then I went for a walk, cleared my head, and then got ready, came here.
And will you work out later today in addition to the walk, or is that today?
So Tuesdays and Thursdays, typically I don't do any resistance training. For me, that's like my cardio or walk or run day.
Wow. Okay. So you too rest.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks for taking us through that.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Let's get to this story. So I already mentioned that you have worked with people at the top of their game, whether that was in the NFL or in esports or now in the corporate world and in life. How did you get to be who you are? What's the backstory here, Taylor?
Yeah, a great question. I think if you were to take a step back and look at it over the course of a timeline, it might seem linear, but as all of us know, when you actually zoom in and look at it in chunks, there's a lot of zigs and zags. And so for me, coming up, I grew up in Northern California. As you and I have talked a lot about, like I was always just a very curious individual. And so much of that curiosity is what led me to the different paths that I've gone down in life. And I've always said my passion is performance, and it's my curiosity that navigates me through the world. So starting out at a young age, I've shared this before, but growing up and being surrounded by my dad and my grandpa at a very young age. I didn't know my grandpa too well because he passed away when I was 2, but playing in his garage. So he was an engineer for NASA. And I remember very fondly of going to his garage, even after he had passed, and all his tools and workshop and cars and all the stuff he was taking apart, putting back together was there. And I just loved playing in that space. I think what it taught me at a very early age is like, my dad would reinforce this. Everything's just a suggestion, right? Things will come with manuals and, a user manual or like instructions, but like in reality, it's all just a suggestion. And so that to me of like taking things apart, putting it back together, more times than not, it didn't always work when I put it back together, but that wasn't really the point. That really fueled a lot of how I chose to navigate things moving forward.
Wow. I've said this to you before, but I think it's so special that your grandfather had such an impact on you posthumously. It's so magical that a big part of who you are, which in a way is a tinkerer.
Very much so.
Came from that time in your grandfather's garage. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. So then what was growing up like in your home?
Yeah. So, my parents were great. They got divorced when I was 12. And even still, had a great childhood. I think so much of it was playing outside, which I know is different for kids these days, but it's all coming back full circle. Playing outside, being with friends, reading, even though like when I reflect back, I don't think me learning and reading really came online. So I was a bit older, but even back then, just the curiosity kind of navigated, kind of put me in different directions to choose what I was interested in. But my parents got divorced when I was 12. And then that was a bit of a disruptor in the childhood for sure.
I bet.
And what that helped me learn is like, okay, you have to appreciate things for what they are in that moment and realize that things will change. Like nothing lasts forever. And that was a good frame, I think, for me to kind of think about as I chose to, the rest of my life.
And you stayed with your mom?
Yeah. So when my parents got divorced, it was actually a pretty nasty divorce. I'm on great terms with my parents now, but at that time I didn't quite understand what was happening. And actually I remember, when my parents sat me down, my sister, I have a younger sister, and they said, we're getting divorced, I laughed. And it was a very interesting experience because reflecting on it now, I laughed because I didn't know what to do. I didn't really know what was happening. I didn't know how to react or how to respond. And what's interesting is that was that pattern that stuck with me. So like anytime a very serious conversation would happen, I would like just default to laughing, like, kind of like this nervous laughter. And, through a lot of work and examination, I'd be like, okay, I've kind of gotten to the root of that and understanding what that was about. But that was something that shifted. So I ended up living with my mom, and I didn't speak to my dad from the ages of 12 to 18, which is a pretty big impact, especially on a young man's life when they're really coming into young adulthood and trying to figure out who they are. And but my dad's one of my best friends now. So we were able to repair and rebuild that relationship. And I've told him before, I think if we had not had that separation, I don't think we would have as good of a relationship as we have now. As crazy as that seems, I think because we're so alike.
That's so
we
interesting.
Probably would have been at all like, oh man, we would have definitely not gotten along.
Wow. So you almost needed that distance to come back together.
I think so. As painful as it was, for both of us, I think we needed that separation to kind of like grow up in our own ways and then come back together and have what we have now.
How are you and your dad similar?
Oh, well, definitely goofy. I think I get my dad's like hippie vibes for sure. My dad's a California guy, went to Berkeley, had long hair, big beard. I get that from him for sure. His curiosity, his playfulness. I think the thing I love most about my dad, amongst many things, everything to him is just a suggestion, right? Everything's just a game. And I mean that in the best sense of like, you can be playful in any situation to bring that joy and curiosity. And it's been, really awesome to see him in that state. It's a little bit different for him now. He's experienced COVID long hauler symptoms. And so seeing that kind of taken from him in that sense is challenging. But overall, just his attitude has been great.
Yeah. So there seems like there's not a lot of downside in that. where do you think you guys would have clashed?
Definitely stubbornness, definitely in our opinions. I think just in kind of where we stand in terms of how we choose to navigate the world is just different in that sense. Like I think the great qualities of the curiosity and the playfulness is awesome. But I think, we've definitely had some hard conversations because they needed to be had. And I just don't think it would have been better had we had those back then versus having them now.
I want to talk about how y'all came back together, but before we do that, I want to hear about what 12 to 18 was like during that formative time without that male figure in your life.
Totally. Yeah, it was incredibly challenging, honestly. And in many ways, I think part of the challenge was knowing that I chose that for myself because I chose not to speak to my dad. The whole dynamic that went down, I made the choice with my mom, and in the process of doing so, like I didn't talk to my dad because of it. And so I think part of it was always seeking out mentors and guidance. I had uncles in my life that were very positive influence on me, but I was always also I was hung out with older kids, and I was always looking for like that role model or that figure to say, okay, like how can I learn from this individual? And it's actually very still true today. I think it's in a much healthier way. Whereas before it was like seeking approval, seeking guidance in the sense of like, I'm not enough. Whereas now it's more of like, hey, there's so much more to learn. It's a different frame for me. It's this seeking to understand, seeking to expand and grow versus seeking the validation of like, just let me know I'm okay.
Yeah. Versus filling the void.
Yeah, exactly. Very much so. And I mean, if anything, filling the void now is like just this massive space of there's so much to learn. And there's so many, like I was on a call earlier today with just a fantastic individual. I was like, oh man, I just want to learn everything or as much as I can from this conversation, whatever conversations we have next.
What did that individual say that made you think that?
Just this whole approach. I mean, former military individual, very much respect the fact that he, went down that path. The work that he's doing now with the private equity space and how he's helping individuals. Really, he went really far down the rabbit hole of understanding trauma and somatics and really this holistic view of a complete human and how to help them move past whatever limiting beliefs they may have so that they can step into a bigger version of themselves, which is so much about the work I do now too. So seeing that and modeling that from an individual who's, 10, 20 years ahead of me, I'm like, oh, this is fantastic.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds like someone I want to meet too. Just stick a pin in that one.
Yes.
Okay. So what were you like in high school? So you're this kid who is kind of seeking validation or trying to fill this void through other relationships. But what were you like?
Yeah. High school was a challenge for me. I think part of it was, one part challenge, another part really just trying to figure myself out, which I think we all do in high school, right? I don't think I think it was you that shared like one of your friends or mentors have the different evolutions of like discovering who you are.
Yeah. Well, I'll actually share it now. Yeah. So a friend of mine that is in her late 60s said to me, life happens in 10-year cycles, which is kind of interesting because I believe in Chinese medicine that they believe it's 7, if I'm not mistaken. And she said, for purposes of this conversation, let's say it's 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. She said 20s are about figuring out who you are, who you want to be, trying on different values for style, different lifestyles. For some people, it's fun. For some people, it's painful. For me personally, it was painful. 30s are about building career, building family, building life, building wealth, accumulating. 40s, you look up and you're kind of like, wait a minute. I've been doing this for everybody else. I want to do this on my terms. So you start to realize that you have agency in all of it. And then 50s are about deciding how you want to age, which I'm in right now, which I think that's super relevant. And I asked her recently, well, what are 60s? And she's like, I'm not telling you yet. So fair. I'm waiting to hear on that one.
Yeah, so, I love that. Right. And so very much like I resonate with that, especially that feels like true of the path that I've been on right now. So high school was challenging in that, didn't have this father figure in my life and did have some positive role models. But, part of leading up into high school, I got picked on a lot as a kid. And that definitely shaped how I related to others in the sense of I accepted people for who they were. I think because I had this sense of like not feeling accepted, I was like, well, I'm just going to accept everybody because I want to be accepted. And so I hung out with everybody. Like I didn't really care what group you were in, if you were like part of the goth crew or like the nerd crew. I was like, I'm a little bit of all that. So it's all good.
You and I share that, by the way. I totally have that too. Yeah. I was bullied and picked on quite a bit. Yeah. And then as a result, had empathy and then was friends with everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's really, it's like seeking to understand. It's like, well, everyone has a unique gift to offer. The other side of that is because I was bullied and because I was open to everybody, there was also this part of me that had a bit of a chip on my shoulder where I was kind of like this protector and I didn't want anyone to fuck with me. And so I developed this persona I went from Taylor to TJ and literally created this persona of like, I never want that to happen to me again. And I'm going to stand up for myself and become a different person because of that. And also like protect those that I love and care around me. And which was great until it actually wasn't, because what ended up happening is I just got in a lot of fights. Now I would never start a fight, but I would definitely finish one. And so it became the kind of thing where just hanging out with the friends that I was friends with, we ended up, just getting a lot of fights in high school. It was like boys in high school will do, especially being on the football team. And in the process of doing so, I was like, I'm actually pretty good fighting, but also realized like fighting is one thing, but learning how to defend yourself was another. And so that led me down the path of really leaning into martial arts and that becoming a big part of my life and learning that aspect of discipline and self-mastery.
Yeah. And you also had a sliding doors moment around this, I recall. So there was a moment where you were confronted with the fact that you were hanging with a crew that was fighting a lot because of something that happened.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So what got me really into the martial arts track was, I was in community college playing, junior college football and still friends with my friends from high school. And there was one night after a game where we didn't all hang out, go out and party, which typically would have happened and probably would have happened is like, drinking as you would, get in a fight, things will happen. Well, I didn't go out that night. For whatever reason, I chose not to. And then I remember waking up the next morning and getting some text messages saying that, basically 3 of my friends had gotten stabbed. So they all went out to party. They got in a fight with some kids and they won that fight. But anyways, those guys came back with knives and they stabbed 3 of my friends. One of them almost died. And that was it was one of those damn moments, being like, what am I actually doing with my life? And that was the first kind of like ping of, okay, maybe there's like a redirect that needs to happen. And a big shift for me was realizing like, okay, I enjoyed football, but I didn't love football. I was not going to go play at a D1 university. I didn't love it that much. And I was athletic, but not athletic enough to go do that. And at the time I was like still interested in, or I'd started to become interested in martial arts. I was like, I'm just going to go do that. Like that to me sounds more interesting. And from the standpoint of really learning how to defend myself. Because I think learning how to fight is one thing, but actually defending yourself like in a way that really makes sense is different. So that led me down the track of martial arts, and then started doing Krav Maga. Then I got into Muay Thai kickboxing, which then that led me into the next kind of jump revolution when I was 20 to go living overseas in Thailand.
Yeah, that sounds like more than a suggestion, as your dad would say.
Yeah.
It sounds like you took it to the next level.
Yeah, for sure.
So you find yourself suddenly you're kickboxing in Thailand.
Yeah.
What was that about? And what was that like?
Yeah. So that was one of those moments where, I'd started going down the path of martial arts and I loved it. And then started training in Muay Thai kickboxing here in the States. This was in California. And then I'm still hanging out with that rough crowd. So I was living in an apartment complex, which felt like a frat house, and woke up one morning and I was like, this can't be the right track. I didn't know what would be the right track, but I knew that this wasn't the right one. And so by process of elimination, I was like, okay, what are actually the positive things in my life? What's bringing me joy? And like, what's got the most potential for a good route? And that was kickboxing. That was the martial arts. And so I made the decision within like 24 hours, like, this is what I'm going to do. I was like, okay, how then becomes, how do I do this? So finished out my semester at community college, sold everything I had, moved back home with my mom, which was crazy. I think we've talked about that before, of like the sacrifices or the choices that you make. I don't think it's a sacrifice. It's the choice that you make, and just appreciating and understanding the implications of that choice, and just choosing, like, whatever you choose, just choose it fully. And that's what I did. And then I remember, say I was 20 years old, left the country and booked a one-way ticket and went out to Thailand.
That's crazy. So you took a step back by moving back home, to take a massive step forward to move to Thailand. And what were you seeking in Thailand? What was your time there about?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think at the time I wasn't quite sure. Looking back now, I was definitely just figuring out more of who I was. And I think the through line, so much of my story and so much of the coaching, the work that I do now is self-awareness drives performance. You can define performance however you choose, but it starts with that self-awareness. And so that was part of my journey of self-discovery, of being 20 years old in a foreign country with no plan on coming home. And just loving every moment of waking up, training 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, and being able to compete, which was awesome. And so I learned a lot about myself, definitely.
You know, what's cool is I'm starting to see the beginnings of your process, the process that because you've coached me before.
Yeah.
So the process that you use.
Yeah.
So in terms of this self-awareness,
Yeah.
I love that you took stock at such a young age and said, hey, what are the things that are going well in my life? What do I love?
Yeah.
What do I enjoy? I'm going to lean into that. And I'm going to move far away from the stuff that does not feel like me anymore.
Yeah.
Okay, so you get to Thailand, then what happens?
Yeah, so being in Thailand was amazing. I fell in love with it. I mean, it was the training, the dedication, discipline, the community. We had this, I was very fortunate to train at a great gym. It was actually the first one that I went to, like literally showed up. I didn't know where I was going to train, but I had like one of those old school booklets, those travel guides of like all the
Wait a minute,
locations.
what? You could not, wait a minute. I did not know this. You didn't have this set up before you just flew there?
Yeah. Yeah. I was like, I will figure it out. Like I didn't quite know which gym I wanted to train at. I was going to test out a couple of different gyms to figure out like what felt like a good fit. And then, it was kind of just like flip to the page. Like, I'll try this one first. That seemed pretty good. It's called Lana Muay Thai. I think it's still around.
That's wild.
Yeah, it was an amazing experience. I mean, what I loved most about that gym was it was international. So we had fighters from all over the world. Very humble individuals too. It's one of the things I love about martial arts. When you find a really good training facility, I mean, everyone's very humble. Partially because they know they could probably kick everyone's ass. But the other part of it is just like the discipline it takes to train and the growth edge that you put yourself into knowingly every day to really expand yourself and really test your capacity. I think it changes you. It puts you in a position of more power, like self-empowerment, which is very unique. And what I loved about this gym too is we had a training facility. I guess you could call it a facility. It was essentially in the mountains. We had this gym, like straight out of Rocky. So you drive 4 hours into the mountains. And this is in Chiang Mai, so northern Thailand. So you drive into the mountains 4 hours, and then you would hike 2.5 miles up. And then there was this beautiful clearing where there was a gym that was built like bamboo structure, and there was like a gym and it was covered. And there was a couple of huts, and there was a little kitchen hut, and there was a family that lived up there that tended to the grounds. And we had like cut trees that were hanging from the rafters and like basically like, horizontal. We would climb underneath that, and that would be like our back squats. We had rings and stuff, for pull-ups and dips and stuff. And every morning we would run the 2.5 miles down and run 2.5 miles up. And we would do that twice a day. We would train there about 4 weeks, about 2 to 3 weeks before heading into a fight. And I loved that. It was such a cool experience being 20 years old. I mean, like, oh, this is what I want to do. Like, this is it. I wasn't planning on coming home until my dad flew out. So my dad flew out for my 21st birthday, right before actually. And at the time I had gotten really curious about sports psychology. And my trainers, after about 2 months, signed me up for my first fight. And I was like, wow, this is very real. Real in the sense of there's an end point that I need to train and get to and work backwards from. And the individual that I'm going to be competing with has been training probably just as hard as me, definitely with more experience, as most Thai fighters have. And the only thing that's going to separate me and him really is going to be our mindset. Because like I knew at that point in 8 weeks, I probably could improve my skill a certain amount. My physical fitness, is still pretty fit. The biggest differentiator or the biggest lift that I saw was my mindset. And so I went super deep into sports psychology and, read Mind Gym and, the inner game of tennis and all these different books around like, okay, how do I start to build my mind in such a way that would prepare me for that? And I fell in love with that. And so when my dad flew out for my birthday, I knew he had this. Well, I didn't know if he had this on the agenda, but it's knowing him. We backpacked through Vietnam and Cambodia as like a little vacation. He goes, have you thought about going back to school? I was like, yeah, actually I have. But like, Chiang Mai has a university. He goes, why don't you come back to school in the States and you can come back? I was like, I think you're onto something there. So that was a big shift for me to then leave and come back to the States to go back to school.
There's that suggestion again.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to talk about something because you've told me a story before that I really love, which I want to hear about how you prepared yourself for that first fight. Because when you really started to get into the psychology of it, I want to know what your process was.
Yeah. So very much kind of going back to the basics around visualization, setting intention, goal setting, and really thinking about what are all the variables that are present in my life at that time and what needed to be amplified or turned up to get me to that place where I knew that I could perform at a high level, which is a lot of just high performance in general. So a big part of the mental game though was rehearsal, like visualization. And so it was walking through the process of what it would feel like to step into that ring or to go to the stadium. So I had my trainers drive me to the stadium and say, I just want to look and see it. And like walk around the stadium and walk inside the ring and like touch the ropes and feel the different elements, and kind of smell the air. So I was trying to collect as much information as I could so that when I would go back and visualize, it was very vivid for me. And I would just get mental reps. And I would rehearse driving to the facility. And I would rehearse warming up at the facility. And I would rehearse stepping to the ring. I would rehearse hearing that bell ring and the music start playing because they would fight to music. And just the whole experience. And that first fight for me, it was literally up until when we made that first connection hit where he kicked and I checked the kick and it was shin to shin. Up until that point, it was deja vu. I was like, oh my gosh, I've been here before. And then once we had that initial contact, then I was like super in the moment, very present to what was ahead of me. And And it was a great fight. I lost on points, but I didn't get knocked down, didn't get knocked out. And I think I learned more about myself in like that 8-week chunk leading up to that moment of that fight than I had in the previous 20 years. It was like just this compression of insight and self-discovery and discipline and perseverance and community of like the rest of the gym coming around the fighters. It was a wonderful moment.
Yeah. You know, you're making me realize that I too really use visualization a ton. A part of it is because I'm a visual person. I'm a visual learner. I love design and aesthetics, but I picture things.
Yeah.
I can picture my future. I can picture future teams. I can picture future businesses. I see numbers as patterns. I can project out P&Ls. So visualization for me personally, I've never quite talked about it or thought about it, but it is a big tool. And it does prepare you, because if you can visualize yourself in a setting when you're actually in it, to your point, you're settled in because you're like, oh, I've been here before. I've done this before. It's not as nerve-wracking.
Definitely. Yeah. And there's so many different ways. There's no wrong way to do it. Definitely the science will back up and say, you know, incorporating at least 3 senses is powerful, right? If you just do one, like just visually, like, yeah, you can get the reps, but if you try to think of it visually, then what are you hearing? And then like, what are you feeling? Right. So you start to incorporate more senses. And if you kind of go through the 5 senses, there's actually 7 kind of levers you can pull. So you have your basic 5 senses, but then there's also emotion and motion. So emotion is like, okay, what are you actually feeling in that moment in terms of an emotional capacity? You know, what's the up and down in terms of that emotion? Or, you know, if you win the fight and you're feeling that sense of joy or happiness, or if you're like behind and you're, you know, maybe you get punched in the face, but like that emotion that's kind of keeping you to push forward. And also like the motion is like you moving in space. And so I think my point is the more that you can make it contextually rich, the more very real it becomes for you, because your mind can't tell the difference.
Man, that's next level. I'm totally going to try that out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's super fun.
Okay. So now your dad has planted the suggestion that maybe you should come back to the States and go back to school.
Yeah.
You've got this newfound curiosity around psychology. What happened next?
Yeah. So back in the States, and then went back to community college and was like, okay, I want to go to a UC school, being in California. Got into UC Davis, which was great. Kind of backdoored them a little bit. Thanks, UC Davis. Went in as a human development major, then switched to psychology. Because school wasn't always easy for me.
Say more about that.
Yeah. So I love learning, but test taking wasn't always like as intuitive for me. And I think too, you know, back in high school, if I think back to that growth trajectory, I just didn't really apply myself. It was kind of like this persona that I put on. I was like, I just didn't care, or like maybe I wasn't smart enough. In reality, it really was. I think my teachers saw a lot of potential in me. I just didn't apply myself. In that curiosity, you know, desire to learn and really apply myself didn't really flip on until I was in community college. And I remember that first community college class of being like, oh, this is different. Like, this is now my destinies in my hands, and I'm in control of who I become and what I do and what I learn, because you can select all these different classes. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. It kind of brought me back to this moment of like tinkering. It's like, okay, what I want to tink and kind of deconstruct and put back together, which I know would become my own education of how I can then navigate the world. So getting to university was amazing in that it gave me a chance to really study under some pretty phenomenal professors. I was very fortunate to have some great teachers throughout my life, and still to this day. But UC Davis was fantastic. You know, I went to human development, changed to psychology, but then I ended up taking an exercise biology or physiology class. And it was the first one of like this series. And I'll never forget this professor, Dr. Shafrath. I can't remember his first name. And he literally rolled into class on his bicycle, because Davis is a big bike community, but like full spandex, as if he'd just been out on the road riding for like, you know, however many miles, but just rolled right into class and gave his entire lecture in his like cycling shoes. I think he had his helmet off, but he's like in his spandex, like giving his class lecture. But he's talking about the body being the system of systems and how everything's interconnected. And I love systems thinking. I think if you can distill things down to the basic fundamental system, like Gall's law is every complex system is built on a simple one. And so if you really distill that down to the first principles, you can really kind of figure out what are the basic building blocks and then build anything from that. And the way he delivered his presentation or his lecture, and the fact that he was honest about it being a hard class, but he was like, I'm going to teach you how to learn better so that you can take tests and actually accumulate this knowledge. And I was like, oh man, this is awesome. And it really inspired me. So from that, I literally left that class. I was like, oh, I could do something with this. And I'd always been, physically fit and always like training. I was like, I'm going to go like be a strength conditioning coach and still kind of take the whole aspects of the psychology. I ended up doing that as a minor, but really lean into the physical, the physiology, the bio, the neuro stuff there. And so literally walked into our D1 weight room. And Matt Brand at the time was the head performance coach. And I walked up to him and was like, hey, I'm your next intern. He's like, dude, we don't have interns. I was like, well, you do now. I'll show up tomorrow.
That's amazing.
He was like, what? I was like, yeah, I'll be here tomorrow. He was like, oh, okay. And ended up working with him, for like 3 years. And he created a position for me, which I was very grateful for. And that's really what set me down the track of being a performance coach.
Yeah. I'm seeing this pattern here of you really not having a model and kind of creating the reality based on your interests.
Yes.
And pursuing that. And I think that's probably why this professor appealed to you too, coming in his cycling kit, is he was doing it on his terms.
100%.
And you are very much doing life on your terms.
Yeah.
Okay. So now suddenly you're a strength and conditioning coach intern, I guess at UC Davis.
Yeah.
Where does that lead you? How do you get from that to the NFL?
Yeah. So, it was hard work. A lot of hard work, dedication, perseverance, shooting my shot. What I did with Matt back then ended up becoming a pattern of just really going for it, which served me very well. So did my time at UC Davis, then I ended up doing some short stints at UCLA and USC. And when I was at UCLA, I met another one of my mentors, Gary Uribe. Shout out to Gary. He took me under his wing and he really started to teach me what it really meant to be a coach at that level and what it looked like in terms of the planning and organization of like, what are the thoughts and nuances that have to go into really creating a successful program. And so when I was at USC, Gary went to Auburn. And so he was at Auburn coaching as the lead assistant. And he calls me and goes, hey man, we might have an opportunity for you here. It's not guaranteed, but you should call Yox. Kevin Yox was the head strength coach. And just kind of like ask and see what's possible. So I didn't really ask. I pretty much called Yox and told him, I was like, hey, I'm going to be your next GA. And he just laughed. He goes, well, we don't have any open GA spots. I'm like, it doesn't matter. I'll be there this summer. He goes, okay. So I packed up, moved across the country, landed in Auburn, Alabama, which was awesome. And within 2 months had a GA spot because one of the GA, just timing was perfect. One of the GAs left. Of course, right? And so I was GA there. And then Gary ended up getting the head job at San Jose State and took me from Auburn to San Jose State. And then that's where the NFL opportunity really started to present itself because San Jose was very close to Santa Clara, which is where the 49ers had their training facility. And so the head performance coach for the 49ers, Mark Uyama, he lived in San Jose. So he would stop by San Jose State on his way home from work and he would just kind of hang out in the weight room. And he was smart because what he was doing is he was kind of like looking and seeing, okay, is there any talent? But he was also planting the seed of like in the off season, could his guys come train there? And so nobody really talked to Uwe because he's kind of this very, in some ways, kind of unapproachable. Uwe's got a vibe to him, very like in his way and very smart, very intelligent. We could be abrasive at times for those who know him. And I've told this to his face, so it was no big deal. But I just was like, you know what? Screw it. I'm just get to know him. And started having a conversation with him. And really the first conversation that I had where he kind of shifted from just like, oh, let's just have a conversation to him mentoring me was I remember just one day just walking up being like, I'm just going to just shoot my shot and be like, all right, what can I learn from this guy? And I said, what's the most interesting thing you've learned lately?
Such a great question.
Yeah.
The curiosity in it is so great.
Yeah. And he kind of looks at me and he goes, oh, okay. He takes me to my office and he goes, look up this guy who's this French track and field thrower, a shot put guy. He goes, I'm going to come back next week. Tell me everything you know about him and his training. I was like, okay. Well, I couldn't find anything in English. So I literally had to like look at all these YouTube videos in French and then like go hire somebody to like translate the text and like try to figure out like what was going on. And I did all this work and I made all these like Google documents and all these things. And like when he comes back in, I was like, okay, I think he's talking about this. And I think he's doing like this complex training, this, that, and the other. And he was like, you did all that? I'm like, yeah, that's what you told me to do. He was like, oh, okay. He was all right. Well, I have all that translated anyways. He's like, but thank you for doing that. But that's really what led down this path of mentorship. And the things I appreciated most about Uwe is he would give me just enough information to send me down this different path, but he would never give me the answer. And it became a conversation of like, okay, well, from what you found, how does that relate to actually the problem you're trying to solve? And that became a really awesome conversation, which really shaped how I thought about solving problems.
Yeah, it's your grandfather's garage all over again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so how did you find yourself ultimately in the NFL then?
Yep. So, I did my time at San Jose State. I knew I wasn't going to move up any more than I was. I was the lead assistant. It's like, okay, I'm ready for a head job somewhere, whether it's in college or, try to figure out what's the next step or maybe move up in terms of a conference. And so Uwe was helping me kind of navigate that space. And one day I was like, I'm just going to like throw it out there. And I was like, called Uwe. I was like, hey, I'm looking at this, that, and the other in terms of job. And I was like, why don't I just come work for you? Just threw it out there. And he goes, well, I'll call you back. I was like, okay. Don't know what that's about, but thought he had another call on the line or something. And he calls me back the next day and he goes, all right, you start in 2 months. And I was like, for what? Just know you're going to be part of the 49ers now. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. Never hurts to ask.
That's huge.
It was huge. Yeah, he gave me a tremendous opportunity and I learned so much being in the NFL, just being around him and the other coaches that we had on staff and the players. It was an amazing experience.
So you finally get to, from my perspective, the ultimate performance environment for athletes anyway, for football players. What was that like for you? And I don't want to lead the witness, but I know it wasn't everything that you thought it was going to be.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, it was just an amazing experience of being in the NFL and everything that comes with it, all the glamour and glory. But on the backside, it's a business. And there's a dark side of the NFL. I think any professional sport, there's like what you see on the front of all the amazing athletes and the training performance and everything there and the money and the contracts. But on the back end, it's a business. And I think there was a real disconnect for me on really treating the players as players and people. Like, I have a confession. So for the 10 years that I coached in college and the NFL accumulated and being in football, I never loved football. Like I never loved the game of football. And the funny part is like, even if you were to ask me about, like, I understand general plays and things like that, but like other of my friends who've never played football and never coached football or anything close to it, like they know way more about the strategy. And like, I just never cared about that. What I cared about was the people playing the game more than the game itself.
Oh my gosh, I can relate to this so much, Taylor. And I've never said this out loud, but as somebody who was a tech exec for 25 years, I know technology. I can speak technology. I don't love it. I don't even know that I like it.
Wow.
And it's, for me, the attraction was the people. I wanted to be around smart people. I wanted to be around people I cared about. I wanted to operate at a high level. I wanted to be challenged. But if I'm being totally and completely honest with myself, I didn't love it. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a big admission for someone who's at your level.
Yeah. And I had to like realize that in order to be like, oh, okay. Because it was interesting. So there's a couple things that happened, right? It was one, the realization of like, okay, this is not the end all be all for me. There's something else beyond this in terms of what I can build for myself. And like, I was always interested in like, really pushing the edge of what I thought was possible. And being in the NFL was great, but there's only 32 teams. So I was like, okay, in terms of my growth trajectory and the goals and aspirations I had in terms of my career, it's like to be a head guy in the NFL. It's like, gosh, this could take a really long time, which I'm all about patience. Right? I feel like patience is one of the virtues that I practice. And I was like, well, if I don't really love the game of football, it doesn't really matter what I do. I just need to find another environment where I can test and tinker and build and try to actualize this knowledge that I'm accumulating and do it in something in a different setting. And so for those that are familiar with traditional sports, when you have losing seasons or not so great, you're not winning, we'll say that, it's very easy for staff turnover to happen. And so that happened at the NFL. So I was there, there were Tom Sula and Chip Kelly. So these were 2 years back to back after Harbaugh. Those were not great years. And so we made it through one coaching change. I didn't think we were going to make it through another with Chip Kelly. And so I was like, okay, I started to think about if I were to do something different, what would that look like? And fortunately, I've always had some amazing mentors and colleagues and associates. So I reached out and said, hey, look, you know me. What else is out there that could be different and that you think would be a good fit for? And so one of my buddies, Rami, he was a CEO of a tech company. He hits me back. He goes, check out esports. And at the time, I didn't realize, I knew of it. I just didn't realize how big it had gotten. And so I started to really explore and be like, oh, wow.
Just to talk about how big it's gotten, if I'm not mistaken, because I looked at it as a marketer.
Yeah.
It was the fastest growing sport in the world.
Yes.
About, I want to say 5 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it surpassed Formula One and some of the other, I think it might be the top sport in the world, if I'm not mistaken.
Probably not right now. It's dropped off a little bit, but back in, 5-6 years ago, it was definitely on the up and up. And when I looked at that, I was okay, there's an opportunity. But the bigger opportunity I saw was nobody was talking about health and wellness for these players. So I was like, oh, that's the opportunity.
Which is so counterintuitive because for people that don't know, esports is gaming.
Yeah.
So when we think of gamers, we picture somebody in their living room, holed up, not really moving, being sedentary. What does it matter what physical condition these people are in?
Yeah, well, it matters the same way that like a knowledge worker or somebody in the tech space or in corporate America, if they take care of their body, they tend to feel better. They tend to do better work, right? So it's the very same in terms of like, what are the foundational components around lifestyle, mindset, nutrition, movement, recovery that could help you perform at a higher level? And for these individuals, to your point, most of them were coming from playing at home to then getting these contracts, which were worth pretty good money. I mean, we're talking 6 figures with streaming deals and sponsorships and things like this. And they would play in tournaments for millions and millions of dollars. Yet nobody was really helping them think through, okay, what does it look like to work backwards from your game day? What does it look like in terms of the health and wellness component so you can play at a high level and do that for as long as possible? So that was the opportunity. And that's what ultimately, when our staff did get let go and I had opportunities to stay in the NFL, I was like, well, if I'm ever going to do something different, now's the time to do it. And so I made that jump. So
not unlike the tech world, teams turn over, right?
Exactly.
When a business isn't performing. So you took the moment to pivot into something that was growing into a high growth area. Tell me a little bit about the physiology, like what's happening to these folks while they're gaming? Because I've also heard that like they're burning thousands of calories. Like even though they may look like they're physically being still, or they may be moving, but they're not running up and down a field.
Totally.
It might be equivalent.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of them, they're putting out a lot of energy. Like our brain is a very very costly organ to run. And so I think there was a study, I can't recall exactly, but it's like a master level chess player will burn like 6,000 calories during a game.
That's wild.
Which is crazy to think about. But there have been studies that focus specifically on gamers, and they've found that, the heart rates will elevate to like 180 beats per minute, which is crazy high if you're thinking they're just sitting there. But really what they're doing is they're so engaged in this virtual environment that, they're responding to the environment as it changes and it's fast paced and it's under time constraints. And depending on the type of game, they have very short cycles of recovery between however many games they'll play in a given setting. So the performance factors are there. It's just a little bit different context.
So what did you do? How did you translate what you were doing for football players to gamers?
Well, first, I just had to ask a lot of questions. I think one of the lessons I learned early on is like, you just make no assumptions and don't try to fit a square peg in a round hole. Because one, it's a different industry with a different culture. So they're kind of be like already a little bit standoffish. I think I had a benefit coming from the NFL, most individuals, whether you're domestic or abroad, kind of understands the National Football League. And that is like elite sport. So that was what I had going for me. But really it was just asking thoughtful questions and trying to understand like what are the problem sets that they're having and like what buckets could I put those in to then say, okay, well, if we were to go try to solve for the biggest problem, which more times than not really was around communication.
Oh, interesting. Really?
Yeah. Effective communication and conflict resolution for sure. But if we could solve for that, but then also teach them about how to eat, move, and be healthy, we could probably get a huge lift in their overall performance.
So you're talking effective communication within the game.
So it's not so much in the game. So yes, and more specifically, how would they debrief what actually happened in a way that was constructive?
Oh.
So it's more about like a retrospective or an after action review. Yeah. So how can you deconstruct the practice or the game itself in a way that was actually constructive? Because what I observed, especially with a lot of these coaches, is they didn't have any formal teaching on coaching or leadership or understanding what it looked like to give constructive feedback. So you have these young individuals who were probably more times than not pro players themselves or played at a high level and then became a coach. There's not an actual track of development for them to be able to do that. And so I'd sit in these meetings and be like, oh, wow, this is not fun to be a part of. And I'm not even one getting the feedback. So it became a lot around like, how do we just help that communication?
Fascinating.
Yeah. And there's a lot just on education too.
Okay. And then what about the physical? Did you do anything in terms of them?
Totally. Yeah. So from a foundational level, it was like, okay, eat, move, and be healthy. So what are we eating? What are we putting in our bodies? And it was all just basic life skill stuff, right? And oftentimes they only know what they know, and you can't fault them from coming from different backgrounds. Or what I really found, Carla, was what had prevented them from getting or having a more healthy life was really three things. It was either a lack of knowledge, a lack of resources, or a lack of confidence. And so if you could give them the first two in the environment that you would create for them and give them the knowledge and the resources that actually like made the most sense for them and create the facility or give them access to the gyms or the food and things like this and get them in the habit and the routine of doing so, the confidence would come. Because it's like trying to, go start a new workout program, but just not knowing what to do kind of becomes like a little bit overwhelming. And you're like, well, I'm not really what to do right now. Yeah. So either do nothing or I try one thing, but I don't do it long enough to actually have it work.
Yeah, it sounds like the basic elements of being successful as a human, and setting people up as a human.
Exactly.
Okay. So you're in esports. What's happening in your life personally at this point?
Yeah. So in esports, there's a lot that happened in terms of like that. It was probably about 5 years or so. Yeah. So thinking about, working in the professional gaming industry, I worked for a holdings company, which we owned 5 organizations and 14 teams and developmental academies. So I was a VP of performance, overseeing all of those operations.
That was a role, not to interrupt you, that was a role you created as well, right? It didn't exist?
Yeah. Yeah. So that was good fortune, really, and just really relationships. I think if I reflect back, another common theme is just like develop relationships. People first. Yeah. It goes so far. Like be a good person and just like develop great relationships. And I've never shied away of being the one to always circle back and check in with people. I think to me it matters because if you're in my circle, then you're in my circle, and that's important to me.
I got that sense from you the first time I met you.
Yeah. I'm so glad we got connected too.
Yeah, me too. Okay. So you're in esports, you're the VP of, you said performance?
Yep. So VP of performance there. And so I was living in Dallas. And then, so did that for about a year and a half or so. And then, the esports industry at the time was still growing, still trying to figure itself out. Mm-hmm. And so that company ended up like dismantling and got sold. And so that was actually a blessing in disguise. Learned a lot, started consulting for a couple of different startups at that time. And then ultimately joined a startup full time. And that was like the transition of being, there's always like these transitions of like coaching's been a through line and all of it. But from coaching in the NFL to then coaching in esports and now coaching in startups, where I was brought onto this organization. I was a number 10 employee.